Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Tim Baker, a distinguished international consultant and the managing director of Winners at Work, a company specializing in helping managers foster productive and high-performing workplace cultures. With over 22 years of experience, Tim has conducted more than 3,000 seminars, workshops, and keynote addresses, reaching over 40,000 people across 11 countries and spanning 21 diverse industry groups. Recognized for his excellence in the field, Dr. Tim was honored as one of the top 50 most talented global training and development leaders by the World HRD Congress. In addition to his consulting work, Dr. Baker is a successful author, executive coach, and master trainer. He also serves as a visiting university lecturer and is a sought after keynote speaker. Dr. Tim Baker holds a bachelor's degree in education, specializing in learning and development from Queensland University of Technology, a Bachelor of Arts in Behavioral Science from the University of Queensland, and a PhD in education with a focus on workplace cultures from Queensland University of Technology. In this episode, Dr. Tim Baker will share key insights from his widely recognized book, Bringing the Human Being Back to Work, the top 10 performance and development conversations leaders must have. So without further delay, let's welcome Dr. Tim Baker to the podcast. Dr. Baker, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Thank you, Deepak. I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Yeah. Dr. Baker, your contributions to the workplace culture, behavioral science, and executive development are remarkable. Could you share a bit about your journey, where it all began, and what initially motivated you to explore these important topics?
Yeah, well, Deepak, the reason I think I'm so interested in the world of work is that we spend 40 years of our life in the world of work, and that's a long time. And yet, if you look at the engagement levels around the world, they're very low. And I don't know what it's like there, but I certainly realize that in many countries, it's a very, very high disengagement level. And I just kind of think that if you're going to spend 40 years of your life doing anything at all and you're disengaged, it's a big waste of a person's life. In fact, it's probably half of our life that we waste. So I was very intrigued by this idea that people should be engaged at work and why people are disengaged. And this level of engagement seems to be going down rather than up. So this is why I'm attracted to the work that I'm doing. And so I've spent my life, 20 years at least, just understanding the world of work and how leadership impacts on that and how it impacts on engagement. So that's pretty much my motivation.
Dr. Baker, you argue that workplaces have become progressively dehumanized over the past century. Can you explain what has happened and why it matters so much today?
Yeah, look, I think, it started over 100 years ago on the Henry Ford assembly line in the United States. I think that scientific management really became very fashionable then. And of course, Henry Ford got Frederick Taylor to come in and look at the assembly line, and he wanted to improve efficiencies. And prior to that, everything was done by, past experience. So people would do things based on what their knowledge was, or perhaps they'd be observing the person next to them. So they had a whole lot of free opportunity to work out how to do the job as well as they can. And what Taylor did is he chopped up the assembly line and he looked at each particular area and he worked out what was the most effective way of doing each job, the most efficient and effective. And so he documented all of that and created what we call scientific management. Now, that happened in the early part of the last century. And since then, successful businesses have actually adopted scientific management. So the most popular example around the world is McDonald's, where everything is done by a system and people spend money on, buying these businesses because they're buying a system. So all throughout the world, we've had this dumbing down of work, this kind of approach. And what it means is that people come to work and they leave their brains, in a paper bag at the doorway, come to work. And so what they do is they just follow these systems. And to me, in the world we're living in now of accelerated change and uncertainty, this is no longer applicable because we never know all the different contingencies that are going on that prevent people from just following, that require people to think, show what I call prudent, independent judgment. So I think that's the reason, and I don't see this changing too much, and it happens across all industries, not just perhaps semi-skilled and unskilled. Even in the medical profession, people have to follow systems, processes, and procedures, scientific management. So I think that's the reason.
In the book, you emphasize the importance of authenticity in the workplace. What does an authentic workplace actually look like in practice?
I think authenticity in the workplace is really the manager and their direct reports working in a constructive relationship. For too long, we've had this them and us, where, and it depends on where you are working in the world, but ultimately the boss has all the power. They make the decisions and the team members carry out these decisions. I'm not sure that's authentic because the manager's not getting good feedback or appropriate feedback because the person on the team member may not feel comfortable giving that feedback, and the manager often doesn't ask for it. So I think that's what I would call inauthentic. And what I believe we need to do is to move to a much better relationship between the manager and their workers. And I'm not talking about a personal relationship. I'm talking about a relationship where it's more collaborative, where we've got a them and us moving to a more collaborative relationship. And I think this is the key. Lots of people think that they're doing this, but there's very little evidence because it's been around since the Industrial Revolution, this them and us. And so it's going to take a long time to change. And I think it is taking a long time to change.
Very insightful. Dr. Tim, you introduced the idea of resisting the dumbing down of work. What are some common examples of this phenomenon and how can leaders actively resist it?
Yeah, look, I think a good example of this is that everyone has to follow systems, processes, and procedures. And so what happens is you get inducted into the workplace and you're told that you've got to follow this system, this process, this procedure. And so what it means is that people don't have to think. And if you've got a decision that you have to make where you can show your own independent judgment, people often don't do that. So what they do is they revert back to the system. Because if anything goes wrong, you can blame the system. You can say it was the system's fault. All I was doing was following it. And so I think there's a lot of this. So on the one hand, we're wanting people to do that, but on the other hand, we want people to show enterprise, we want people to be creative, we want people to show prudent, independent judgment. So the employee is confused. So what they do, given a choice between the two, is they'll follow the system. And I can give you a good example of this. I was working in Asia and I was doing a workshop and staying at a five-star hotel. And I had probably the nicest meal I've ever had in one of the restaurants attached to the hotel, beautiful Thai food. And I remember I got up out of my chair at the end of the dinner and I went up to the reception. And, the receptionist was smiling and said, "Hello, Dr. Baker, how can I help you?" So very courteous. And I said, "Look, I've just had one of the most beautiful meals I've ever had, and I was wondering if I could get the recipe because my wife likes to cook Thai food, and it'd be lovely to get that recipe." And of course, her face just went white. She was panicking because she didn't know how to answer this question. And of course, what she wanted to do was to look under the reception desk for the manual to try and work out, well, if someone asks this question, what do you do? Well, of course, there's no manual question about this. It was a completely unusual question. But she panicked. And then she said, "I'll have to get my supervisor." Her supervisor came in and he started to panic because he didn't know what to do. And so he invited his manager in. And here am I having a conversation with three people. All I wanted was the recipe. But because it was unusual and these people were trained to follow systems, They had no idea. And that's an example of what I'm talking about. I did, by the way, get my recipe, which was very nice, but it was a lot of work to get it. So it was interesting, but that to me is an example of this dumbing down of work.
Dr. Baker, your book outlines 5 developmental conversations leaders should have. Could you briefly explain what these conversations are and what they are so crucial?
Yeah, absolutely, Deepak. This is what I call the 5 conversations framework. I put this together many years ago in one of my books because I didn't believe in the performance review. So I thought, well, we should be having a regular conversation on performance. Shouldn't be just left as a big event at the end of the year. And these 5 conversations, I think, are critically important. And of course, we don't discuss these 5 conversations during the review because there's just not enough time. We're too busy trying to evaluate people's performance. But let me give you a little bit of a sense of what they are and how they might work. The first conversation is the climate review conversation. Now, it's got nothing to do with the weather, of course, but it's got everything to do with how people are feeling in their job satisfaction, morale, and communication. And so, what we do is we ask people on a scale of 1 to 10. First question: on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 is high, 1 is low. How would you rate your current job satisfaction? And people will score it whatever. They might score it a 5 out of 10. And then the manager can then say, well, why? Why is it a 5 out of 10? And of course, that opens up a really rich conversation around how people are feeling at work. Of course, this goes up and down depending on what's happening. But at the end of the day, it gives people a benchmark. And then the next question that you ask people around that is, do you believe it's possible to go from a 5 to a 6 or a 5 to a 7? Because sometimes a 5 is as good as it gets. And then people might say yes. And then, of course, the manager can say, well, what can we do to help you improve your own job satisfaction from a 5 to a 6 or a 6 to a 7 or whatever? So this is just a really affirming conversation to see where people are at. Companies spend, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars, big companies, on climate, on these online surveys. But the reality is, why doesn't the leader just talk to his or her people about these things? Why do we have to do these long-winded and very expensive surveys? And often the results aren't shared with employees anyway. So it's ridiculous, and it's a good, nice way to start. So climate review is number one. Number two is the strengths and talents conversation. And what that's about is to actually start with what people are actually good at. Let's not go with what people can't do. Let's talk about what people are good at. Now, the first question in that conversation is not what is your strength? Because if you say, what is your strength? People go, oh, well, I don't know. I don't know what my strength is. But at the end of the day, if you ask them, what is the one thing that you enjoy most about the work you do? Hopefully there's something. The person will say, oh, I enjoy working with customers. This is their strength because there's a high correlation between what people enjoy and what people are good at. So by asking people what they enjoy, we're actually talking about what their natural talents are. Then the conversation can move to, well, what can we do in your current job to give you more opportunity to do that, which is the thing that you really enjoy? Now, sometimes there's nothing because all sorts of practical reasons, but at least we've had this conversation with people. So we're understanding what their natural strengths are. And of course, when an opportunity comes, or a project, or an assignment, or a task, the manager can then delegate that to the person, knowing that they can do a good job on that, they enjoy it, and they're usually quite good at it. So it's an upward spiral of positivity rather than downward spiral of negativity. And it's a very affirming conversation. Conversation three is opportunities for growth. Now, of course, this is what we talk about most of the time in the performance review. And of course, it has a place. But let's talk about it in the context of what people are good at, and then let's go to that. So I then ask people to come to this conversation having thought about this. So the question is, if there was one thing that you could work on in the next 6 to 12 months in terms of your own work performance, what would it be? That's all I'm asking. And they come to the meeting having thought about this. So they own their level, they own their particular opportunities for growth, they own that area. And then I'm going to listen to them and I'm going to ask them, well, why is this important? How is it impacting on your work? What can I do to support you? You see, so we're now at the stage where we've talked about their job description, we've talked about their strengths and talents, and now we're going to talk about their opportunities for growth. In conversation 4, we bring all that together in a learning and development conversation. And really, it's about trying to collate how the manager can actually assist and support that person to be more effective in being able to, build on their strengths and to minimize their opportunities for growth, or to develop their opportunities for growth. So this is like a training needs analysis. And again, we spend hours and hours and hours doing all of this across the organization. Why aren't we just talking to people about it? Why aren't we just sitting down and discussing it and on a regular basis? The final conversation is innovation and continuous improvement. And of course, companies all over the world are saying, how can we become more innovative? How can we continuously improve? But for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, the dumbing down of work, people aren't going to be forthcoming with this. And many of them think that anyway, it's the manager's job to come up with that, but it's everybody's job. And the manager, by opening up a conversation about this, they are then in a position where they can assist, get the person to share with them. It might be just simple things like a notice board. It could be a bit of feedback about the meeting so that we share the knowledge. All of this sort of stuff is all innovation and continuous improvement. It doesn't have to be a Nobel Peace Prize type thing. It can be a simple thing. So if we want more innovation and continuous improvement, why don't we just talk about it? Why don't we just get people to share what their ideas are? So again, I ask people to come to that meeting having thought about this so that when the manager asks them, they've got an idea and we can then talk about this. Not all ideas are great ideas. And it's quite reasonable that a manager may not think that this is practical or it won't work or it's too expensive. Fine. But at least we're asking people. There's a good chance, however, that there's going to be something decent, something useful that has come out of that conversation if you're having a conversation with, say, 10 people. And then you implement this, and then the team says, oh, that's great. The manager's actually gone out of their way to implement that idea. So maybe I have ideas that I can share. So I think that works extremely well. And over 5 months, you have one of these conversations for about 20 minutes, no more. And then when you're finished, you can have a little break and you start again. So over the course of a year, 10, 20-minute conversations about these topics can make a massive difference in changing the relationship that I've been talking about.
Of the 5 developmental conversations like coaching and relationship building, which one do you find leaders struggle with the most and why?
I think they struggle with them all, to be honest. But I think I think the one that they probably struggle the most with is the innovation and continuous improvement conversation. I'll tell you why, because I think a lot of people in the team think that it's the job of the leader to come up with these ideas. It doesn't mean that the leader has all the ideas. And so a manager also thinks that if they ask team members these questions, they'll lose some control and they'll lose some ability to be able to be worthy and to have some value that they're adding to the team. Not true. In fact, you're increasing your ability to get things done by asking. But I think a lot of managers have a problem with this because they think that their role entails that, but it's not. It's really about drawing out of their people the thoughts and ideas about how things can be improved. I think managers have trouble with that idea, but they probably a challenge with all of them too, I have to say.
On the performance side, you introduce five other conversations, including climate review and innovation. How do these conversations differ from traditional performance reviews?
Yeah, look, I'm not a fan of the performance review. In fact, my book, The End of the Job, The End of the Performance Review, tells you a little bit about what I think. I thought it was rubbish, and there's no research that shows that actually performance reviews actually increase performance. Nowhere in the world will you find any research about that. If you do, send it to me because I've never seen it. So therefore, the question might be, well, why do we do it? Why do we do it if it doesn't increase performance? Why do we tick all the boxes and why do we do this? And so employees are cynical about it. Managers are cynical about it. HR is even cynical about it. So we go through this incredibly expensive exercise once, twice a year. So my thinking is that the performance review is about appraisal, whereas performance conversations are about development. And you can't actually appraise and develop pretty much in the same meeting because it's just too much. So we end up just ticking some boxes and giving people a rating, say out of 5. And there's no feedback about developing any of these things, or if there is, it's very little. And sometimes it's quite a shock to the employee because they've never heard this information before. Because the manager thinks to themselves, well, I've got a review coming up in 3 months. I'll just save it all up. Then I'll have something to talk about during this review conversation. But really, and then the employee's blindsided, so they don't even listen to the feedback if they get any in the first place anyway. So I think to sum up, the performance conversations are about development and the appraisal conversation is about appraisal. They are different things. And it's like, the example I'd give you is if someone went to a gym and they're exercising and they're wanting a coach in the gym. And which coach would you have? Would you have the coach that was watching you throughout your workout and then gave you a score? I'll give you a 4 out of 5 on this and a 3 out of 5 on this and a 2 out of 5 on that. Would you want that, or would you want a coach that's walking around with you who's saying, okay, keep your elbows back, uh, stick your chest out? So they're giving developmental type advice so that by the end of the workout, you actually know how you can improve the next workout rather than, oh, I got a 3 out of 5 on my bench press. People go, well, what does it mean? And how can I go to 4? And this is the problem. So I think there is a big difference between the two, Deepak.
Dr. Baker, you mentioned that organizations often lump human resources together with the technological and financial resources. What
Yeah.
mindset shift do you think leaders need to make to break out of this habit?
Yes, I think there's a cliche all over the world that people are our greatest asset. We hear it all the time, and most of us kind of we know we kind of turn away from it. But the truth, it is true that people are our greatest asset. So it's more than a cliche. But of course, people don't spend a lot of, managers and organizations don't spend much time on this. I don't know what it's like in your country, but certainly, people call it human resources. This is the human resources department. And years ago, I was at the forefront of saying to people, why don't you change the department name to people and culture? Because it better reflects your best resources, which of course are the human beings that work there. So why not do this? And of course, a lot of organizations have done this now, and that's good. But still, HR is caught up in systems and processes and procedures, like I mentioned earlier, and they forget it. At the end of the day, if you really step back and think about it, what's an organization? It's a bunch of people working towards a common cause. And the key word in there is people. And you take the people out and there's not much left. And so I personally think that, if we're having these regular dialogues with our people, we are engaging them in the work that we do. Exit interviews show clearly that one of the reasons that people leave their job is because they've had a fight with their boss. They don't get on. Maybe he or she is a micromanager or something like this. We don't like it, so we decide to leave. Now, of course, we don't tell anybody, they don't tell the boss that. But when the exit interviews happen, which is the last interview before you walk out the door, people will often say, the real reason I've left is because I have no dialogue, no relationship with my boss. So if we're looking at trying to keep our best people, which is exactly what we should be doing, if you want to make sure that happens, it's the job of the leader to develop a good working relationship. And that's where conversation comes in. I'd go even further and say that organizations are really conversations. If you think about it, there are hundreds, depending on the size of the organization, thousands, tens of thousands, or even millions of conversations that go on every day. Some of them happen in the boardroom, some of them happen in the lunchroom, some of them happen in the car park, some of them even happen in the toilet. They happen everywhere. And so the question is, how can we elevate and improve the quality of conversations that go on in the world, in the workplace? If we're trying to change culture, this is the answer. It's not about the 8 steps of this and the 10 steps of that. It's about how we improve and enrich the dialogue. How do we get away from what Linda Grattan calls dehydrated conversations, which is just like chit chat? And then there's chit chat on the one hand, and then there's project based conversations on the other. Well, obviously, chit chat and project conversations are important. There's a big thing in the middle that's missing, which is these developmental conversations. So, if we can elevate these, then we bring the human being back to work and we improve the quality of the engagement between the manager and the particular employees. Yeah.
In your experience working with organizations globally, what are the some signs that a workplace has successfully brought the human being back to work?
Well, look, it's patchy, and I think sometimes you read these great stories. You read great stories that, this company is just so people-centric and so forth. But interestingly enough, when you actually go in and you observe what's going, it's nowhere near as good as it comes across. It looks like it's, perfect and wonderful, and I think there's a good reason to. So what I guess I'm saying is that people are in transition between the old them and us and collaboration, which is the new dynamic in the employment relationship. I think most companies are in the middle. So, they've got away, I think, from the them and us. Most of the successful ones have, but they haven't quite got to where I think they should be. And I think it's because if you think about it, the Industrial Revolution is not, what are we talking, 200, 300 years ago? This is not a long time in the scheme of things. And so this employment relationship, this old them and us, has been around for a long period of time. It takes a long time to change this. And if you think about it, as a manager, where do you learn to become a manager? From your boss. Well, where does he or she learn? From their boss. And if there's old habits of this sort of them and us relationship going on for generations, then it's likely that that will continue. So I'm positive about the fact that it's moving in the right direction, but I think it's nowhere near where it needs to be. And I think there's a huge amount of scope to improve. And my work is around really the individual relationship between the leader and their team members. And I think, I don't mean it's about being soppy and, kind. And I mean, kindness and it's good and all the rest of it, of course, courtesy and respect are critical. That should happen anyway. But it's really about being on the same page. so that the team member knows what the boss thinks, knows what the team member thinks, and so they both can work more effectively together. And to me, we're still a long way. A lot of, for example, a simple example, there's a lot of people, managers that say, I really like your work, Tim, and I'm going to, buy your book and we'll do the conversations, rah, rah, rah. And then what happens is very simply that work gets in the way, work as in, the project. And so people get so involved in that, they come back to me often and they say, we have no time. We have no time to have these developmental conversations because work gets in the way. What are they really saying? Well, people are secondary and work is the important thing. Well, of course, work's important, but you show me a great leader, and there are great leaders around. Those leaders will inevitably having regular conversations with their team members. They do it regularly, and then nothing gets in the way. And this is the big difference between an outstanding leader and a mediocre leader. And, so if someone wants to get this little extra discretionary effort, if they want to improve engagement, if they want to improve trust, there's only one way to do it, and that is one conversation at a time, a developmental conversation. My colleague in the United States, Jim Kuzner, who wrote a wonderful book, Credibility, argues that leadership is a relationship. This is the first chapter of his book. It's a very, very, very insightful topic. Now, it's not a personal relationship, of course, but it's a relationship nevertheless based on, meeting expectations and being clear about these things. This is the big challenge for where we need to be right now. And, coming back to your question, I'm not sure that a lot of organizations have really mastered this. I think some managers and leaders have, but it's patchy. So if you look at an organization that's got 1,000 leaders, not all of them would understand that sort of understand what I'm talking about, but they're not practicing it. So it'll be patchy. You'll find, in those organizations, there'll be pockets where things are working really well. In other areas, the manager's not making any attempt or not making any effort to have these developmental conversations, or if they start doing it, they stop doing it. And the feedback I get is that employees enjoy these conversations because it gives them more time with their boss. And that's a good thing. And interesting enough, the managers actually enjoy it too because they're quite surprised about what employees think, and they can reconnect with them and to orientate their approach to help that particular person work, more effectively. So I think it's patchy, Deepak. I don't think you can say, well, this company's doing a great job, this one isn't. I think it's all comes back to the individual manager. And, is it about entitlement? No. I mean, any leader that thinks they're entitled, why would they possibly want to have a conversation with anyone? I'm entitled to make decisions. I'm entitled to be in charge. I'm entitled to, to give people orders and directions. It's not. Leadership, of course, is a privilege. And this goes to the heart of it. If a leader believes that they are in a position of privilege, that this is a privileged position that I'm in, then they're likely to take on board what you and I are talking about now. So it very much depends on how the leader views their role. There was a great article called "Why Should Anyone Be Led by You?" Harvard Review. And really, it's a wonderful question. Why should anyone be led by you is a great question because really, any leader should be able to answer that question. Otherwise, they probably, if they're entitled, they can say, well, I've been working hard here for 10 years and I'm entitled to this position of leadership. No, not necessarily. You have a huge responsibility. So I think it comes back, this is at the heart of why leaders should lead, is really around this whole basis of privilege, being, seeing it as a privilege rather than an entitlement.
Dr. Baker, if a manager wanted to start implementing your 10 conversations today, where should they begin? Is there a first conversation that sets the tone for the rest?
Yeah, look, I think there is, and often when I talk to people about these things, of course, if I'm coaching them, they say, "Great, I'm going to go away." And if I come back in 6 months' time, what I find is that they use these conversations to talk about the project that they're working on, and or the work that's in front of them. By the way, while you're here, how are you going on that report? And then they get into this conversation about this. These conversations happen anyway. So I feel that people need a train track to run on. Okay, so they need some guidelines. And so when I talk about the 5 conversations framework, this is precisely what it is. It's a framework to help people to actually know where to start. So I think, to answer your question, the place to start is a climate review. So start with a question on a scale of 1 to 10. 10's high, 1's low. How would you rate your current job satisfaction? Now, I can guarantee to you, if you ask the question, eventually they'll give you a number, and then you can ask why, and then you can ask, do you think we can improve this? And then you can talk about what you as a leader can do to help this person improve their engagement and so forth. That'd be the place to start, Deepak, and then of course then you can move on to the other 4 conversations. So it's a simple conversation and it's insightful, and the person on the receiving end is often going to give you some really rich information that you probably hadn't considered because the reason to ask people a score. So if I said to you, Deepak, honest, how's your job satisfaction now? You're probably going to say something like, oh, it's okay. Then it's a dead end. But if I said to you, give me a score out of 10, uh, you're forced to give me a rating. And by giving me a rating, I can then ask you to justify that rating, you see. So I'm now going to get much richer information, and that information can guide and inform how we will continue to work together. That's where I would start. Absolutely.
Yeah. Dr. Baker, my last question. Looking ahead, do you think the future of work will naturally tend toward rehumanizing the workplace, or will it take a deliberate, sustained effort from leadership?
It's a very interesting question, isn't it? I think are we going to continue to dehumanize work or not, or are we? Now, obviously, AI is critically important to our futures, and this is here to stay. There's nothing we can do about it. But at the end of the day, what it means is that we're expecting people, ironically, now to use their own judgment about how they're going to use the data that comes out of these systems. So it's imperative, actually, that we get people to think for themselves. I found it very interesting, and I think COVID was a very interesting time in our history because apart from working from home, which is now here to stay, one of the other changes, a lot of managers said to me at the end of this COVID period we all went through, they said, I was so pleasantly surprised at how much initiative people showed. Well, first of all, I felt like saying, well, why were you surprised? Because, it should be fairly, people do have judgment, independent judgment, and they can exercise it when they need to. So that was the first interesting thing. But then it gave leaders a little more confidence, I think, to realize that people can actually be autonomous, make independent judgments. So I'm positive about it, but I think, sooner or later we've got to get the balance right between follow these processes, systems. Absolutely. There's a place for this, obviously. It doesn't matter what the business is. But there's also a place for independent judgment. And it's been too heavily weighed towards a systemized approach, which is the dumbing down of work I talk about. A simple practical exercise for your viewers and listeners. if you sit down with your team and you get yourself a whiteboard, and on the whiteboard you draw yourself 2 lines down on the page, so you've got 3 columns. And on the left-hand side, you say to your team, what are all the things that we do in our team where we have to follow systems, processes, and procedures? And you fill up that list, and there's going to be lots and lots and lots and lots of things, safety issues, compliance issues, write them all down. And then go to the furthest column away and say, what are all the opportunities for us to show autonomy and prudent independent judgment? Now, this will take some time. People will find it hard to answer this because we're so, as I say, we're so systemized. Persevere, write down a few things. And then the middle column is where people can either follow the system or they can show independent judgment. And this is the problem. The middle is the problem, because when we're faced with the dilemma, do I follow this process or do I think for myself? The natural tendency would be follow the system, because you can't get into any trouble, because the system, you can blame the system if it goes wrong. And so by just doing that simple exercise, you are alerting people that there is scope, there is opportunity to show independent judgment. And in fact, we expect you to do that. And so that makes a big difference. And I think, that'd be a practical way for a manager to bring the human being back to work, as we've been talking about. And of course, the next big mistake is that if people do show independent judgment, they make a mistake, what happens then? This is a problem, because then the manager has a frown on their face, or they're angry or whatever. Well, as soon as they do that, people get angry and they get upset because, you told me I could show independent judgment and I did, and now I'm in trouble. So the first thing the manager must do is say, thank you. Thank you for backing yourself. Okay, it didn't work out. What would you do differently next time? You see, so the message is, I want you to continue to use your brains. Sometimes it works, but sometimes we follow systems and they don't work either. But thank you for doing that, because it's important. I call this, Deepak, I call this the proactive paradox. I wrote a book about this. The proactive paradox is a simple process. The manager goes to one of our training courses, and, in the training courses, we teach them to, back their people, get them to show autonomy. And so the manager comes back all excited, and he or she says to their team, I want you to show independent judgment at the right place at the right time. And all the team people sitting around the table, they sit there, or maybe they're on Zoom or whatever, and they sit there and they go, oh, well, I'm not sure my manager really means that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit on my hands and I'm just going to follow procedures, because I'm not sure he or she really means that. And so the manager observes this behavior. And then the first thing is they say, oh, Tim Baker's training course was no good, or what, that was, that's not working. And what does he or she do? They jump in to the space, the vacuum, and they do the job now. And why do they do that? They say, well, no one else is showing independent judgment, so I'm going to. And then the team members observe the manager, and they go, aha, I knew you weren't serious, because if you were serious, why would you be involved in this stuff? You see, so it creates a paradox. It's like a dog chasing its tail. It never catches it, but it's always entertained. So this is hard. This is elusive. So obviously it requires the manager to have a conversation with that person and encourage them to show more independence. And if they do that, then the person is in no doubt about, the fact that they should do that.
Thank you, Dr. Tim Baker, for sharing your invaluable insights and experiences with us today. Your work in revitalizing workplace culture and putting the human being back at the center of organizations is truly inspiring. Through your expertise drawn from decades of research, consultancy, and leadership development trainings, you have given us a clear roadmap for creating more authentic, high-performing, and human workplaces. We look forward to the following your continued contributions to the field and to seeing the positive impact of your work will make across industries worldwide. Thank you once again for joining us, Dr. Tim Baker.
Thank you, Deepak. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.